Brannon House.
Colonel Rob Maness has a lifelong record of providing dedicated service to this nation. Having worked his way up from the enlisted ranks to full colonel, he served our country for more than 32 years. He has served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff operations officer, assisted the national security team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan and served as the vice commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
We're back with more changes at DoD, and this time an update on COVID-19 and reinstatement. We all know that the previous administration issued unlawful orders on mandatory vaccines on an experimental vaccine, COVID-19. You know it, we know it. We're doing everything we can, as quickly as we can, to reinstate those who were affected by that policy. It hasn't been perfect, and we know that. We're having an ongoing conversation with you to get it right, working with the White House as well. We want anyone impacted by that vaccine mandate back into the military, people of conscience, warriors of conscience, back in our formations. We hear you, and we're working to get updated guidance as quickly as possible. So kind of here's where we are on more guidance we're providing right now. So in January, the president issued his executive order. We jumped right on it. In February, I directed the department to take corrective action regarding this specific department's unfair, overbroad, unnecessary COVID vaccine mandate. You know, we apologize then, apologize now for how it was done, and we want to fix it. So today, I'm signing a memorandum that directs the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness to provide additional guidance to the boards that are reviewing these cases concerning the review of requests from service members and former service members adversely impacted by COVID-19 vaccine mandate. The guidance also will facilitate the removal of adverse actions on service members solely for refusing to take the COVID-19 vaccine, including discharge upgrades and less than fully honorable discharges for individuals separated for refusing to take the COVID-19 vaccine. So we're trying to scrub all that, clean all that up. We'll also facilitate appropriate remedies for service members who have suffered additional career setbacks resulting from the previous administration's unlawful vaccine mandate. So that original EO addresses the unfair, since rescinded COVID-19 vaccine mandate imposed on warfighters during the previous administration. We know how bad it was. You know how bad it was. And through this guidance, which I encourage you to check it all out directly, because it's an update going even further than what we've done in the past, this memo is providing supplemental remedies for service members and veterans negatively impacted by the DoD defunct COVID-19 disease vaccine mandate. So more guidance here that we think is really important in getting this right, and we welcome you all back as quickly as possible.
The military vaccine mandate was unlawful. Welcome back to Truth Thursday here. The Rob Maness Show is live on Worldview Tube. Our X Spaces simulcast Rumble, YouTube, Truth Social Plus, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and Roku. Well, there it is, folks. The military COVID vaccine order was unlawful. Well, here's my message for DOD. We appreciate your frank assessment, Mr. Secretary, and your ongoing efforts to correct this unlawful behavior and its outcomes. But the process cannot end at reinstatement of only the approximately 8,500 service members involuntarily separated solely for refusing the vaccine. Those words are important. They keep showing up in every memo, by the way. The actions of the Department of Defense, every service department, legal counsels, every civilian employee leader, every general and admiral, every commander, and every senior non-commissioned officer, when they enforce this illegal order, have to be held accountable. And each and every service member unlawfully discharged or coerced to leave the service through retirement or election not to reenlist must be made whole in the way that they feel they should be made whole. By some estimates, that's nearly 100,000 Americans who served honorably and paid a heavy price when they stood up to challenge the unlawful order through the avenues lawfully available, such as religious exemption requests, medical exemptions, and the request to have an FDA-approved vaccine, which was never made available. We teach them to do that. Well, clearly, sir, we are not there yet, and we know you are listening. So we will continue to bring to light as many of these cases as possible as your growing team adjusts its policies to meet the needs of these service members whose lives have been so severely and heavily damaged, and it extends out to their families. And I would encourage you to hire people into these positions that are making these memos and sending them to you that have the bold character enough to step out of their comfort zones. Well, my guest today is Texas native and former Army infantryman Derek Wynn. Derek is currently suing the United States and the Department of Defense for its unlawful mRNA vaccine mandate, and like me, is an original signer of the Declaration of Military Accountability that came out at the beginning of 2024. Derek, welcome to the Rob Maness Show, sir. Thanks for your service, man.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, hey, I just wanted to give you the chance to tell folks, why'd you join the Army in the first place?
I joined the military, much like many other infantrymen. I felt I owed this country a debt. I felt I owed this country service due to being, fortunate enough to be born in the greatest country to exist on the face of this planet. And I wanted to serve my entire life. Fresh out of high school, I didn't honestly feel too good about the war in the Middle East, so I kind of held off. And eventually, later on in life, I started to realize this window of opportunity to serve was quickly closing. So on my 29th birthday, I flipped a coin, and it came up heads. And the next day, I was at the recruiting office, and I had always felt an obligation, not necessarily an obligation, but a duty to serve, to give back to the millions of people who have died to give me what we have today. So I truly believed in these values, that the military portrays, loyalty, duty, selfless service, sacrifice, courage, all these things. Like, they're not just hollow words to me. They're something that I truly valued my entire life. And so the hollowness of the words, hearing the DoD kind of portray these values as if they're held up by them. I just want to see them kind of carry that out.
Yeah, absolutely, my friend. I appreciate you telling your story about how and why you enlisted. It's different for every American. I come from a long line of people that have served over generations in our family, so it was kind of a natural thing for me. But I have three brothers that one other one that served, but the other two did not. It's a big decision to raise your right hand and take the oath of office and the oath of enlistment to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and to follow the lawful orders, right? Follow the lawful orders. Your story really stood out to me when I was reminded of it the other day. I saw you appear on Dr. Mary Talley Bowden's show, and I appreciate her interviewing you. So I wanted to get you on and broadcast it out again. Talk us through the circumstances that led up to your decision and what that decision was about this vaccine mandate order that now Secretary Hegseth has said is unlawful. What were the circumstances that led up to that, and what was the decision? How did you choose to push back on it?
Certainly. So there was kind of like a slow creep with the mandates. Everybody could kind of see them slowly approaching, but at the time, the government was still gaslighting us into believing that this was, hey, we're doing this because we care about you, and this is entirely voluntary, because they were trying to coerce as many people as they could into voluntarily taking this so that they wouldn't be able to make a claim later on in the future when they inevitably were negatively affected by it. So there was, I joined kind of at the height of COVID when there was still, they were still pretending that mandates would never happen and this was always going to be voluntary. So I never anticipated that that the mandates would reach, deep within the infantry. So I enlisted later on, as they slowly creeped and started moving the goalposts in their favor. You could see a lot of interagency collusion going on. And between these government agencies, you could tell that there was, the very day that something would get approved by the CDC, the DOD would hop onto it. And so there was an obvious heavy hand from the top down. And anyone who was kind of inside that meat grinder could see it for what it was, with, just using the slightest amount of skepticism, and so we could see that there was something being pushed onto us. And they were offering these incentives at first, like, oh, we'll give you like a 4-day weekend, or, if you get vaccinated, you don't have to do X, Y, Z. And there was all of these, incentive programs being set up, and they were framing this as a readiness issue, so that leaders were put into a position to where, we were technically at war with COVID. So commanders were told, this is a readiness issue. If you don't get 99.9% of your guys vaccinated, we're going to replace you with somebody who will. So that created an environment for leadership within the DOD to basically, from the top down, burn your own guys. And so you push that down through 5 or 6 levels of command, and there's no one, in my position, there's no one for me to express my grievances to, because everyone in the chain of command is now culpable by it, because this came from the top down. So my direct leadership, initially, once I was able to articulate to them my reasonings for refusing the vaccine, because we knew that they had 0 FDA approved vaccines in their possession, DOD wide, and legally the SecDef mandated that everyone received an FDA approved vaccine. So right. A lot of people inside the DOD, excuse me, a lot of people inside the DOD started calling them on that, and there was this kind of tug of war within the DOD. Because lawyers, this was being handled by lawyers every step of the way. Anyone in any position to actually lead, or anyone who was put in a position to lead their men, 9 times out of 10, they delegated their duties to some JAG officer who was coaching them every step of the way, handing them these cookie cutter, paperwork, basically just fill in their name here and sign at the bottom, because there was no playbook for this. So everyone delegated their leadership to lawyers, and every step of the way, lawyers were coaching them to do things that were in favor of the DOD instead of in favor of their men. So once that environment was created amongst leadership, basically they turned the juice up, to 10, because they basically were now. I've said this before many times. The mafia never handed out job applications. All they ever did was put people in positions to benefit from their corruption. And that's basically what happened within the DOD is weak leaders who are willing to succumb to pressure to benefit themselves or progress their own careers, basically burn their own guys, because the pressure was too much. And then the few people that did buck back, they would find administrative ways to either, take them out of their positions and replace them with somebody else, or just closet them to make sure that they couldn't expose their beliefs to anyone else. And, they specifically started targeting the chaplain corps and telling these chaplains not to give out religious accommodations and stuff like that. There were operations going on basically within the DOD, like these psychological operations to target specific groups of people, and prevent them from promoting these religious accommodations, prevent them from talking about, the minutiae distinctions between these new mRNA shots and the vaccines that we're accustomed to taking and stuff like that. Because what they did is they intentionally muddied the waters. Once people within the DOD came out and started saying, hey, we want the FDA approved shots and we know you don't have them, there was this stalemate that happened. And for a few months, nobody really knew what to do because it was still being worked out and legal. So everybody was just getting grinded down until somebody from legal told these leaders what to do. Well, it turns out that the Terry Aderim, they sent her out, and she puts out a memo force wide, and this memo basically it says, even though these vaccines are not FDA approved, they're formulated in the same way that this one vaccine, which was FDA approved, they're formulated in the same way, so you can use them as if they were FDA approved. And from then on, that was the green light for commanders to basically say, well, now you refuse this vaccine, we're using it as if it's FDA approved, so now we're gonna burn you. And that was everything that they needed to basically change the law in their favor. And they were gaming this every step of the way, kind of just jamming square pegs into round holes and doing everything they could to hammer down on dudes and make them basically submit to this.
We got to take a commercial break, Derek. When we come back, though, I want to continue this conversation. We'll hear a little clip from former JAG, Casey Dixon, who was one of the lawyers that didn't do what you just talked about and participate in this, what I call a conspiracy to deprive you of your rights. We'll be right back with Derek Wynn, U.S. Army infantry veteran, an American harmed by the unlawful order to give the COVID vaccine mandate. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now, and we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
All right, an unlawful order. What does that mean? Does that mean that every commander who issued that order is now open to civil and possibly even criminal liability? Maybe. What does that mean for the 7,000 soldiers and airmen and Marines who were kicked out? Can they start suing? Maybe. I want to bring in now retired Air Force Major and JAG Officer Casey Dixon is with us. Major, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All right, what do you think those words actually mean?
Well, I'll say I'm still kind of reeling from the announcement because this has been a hard-fought battle to have that admitted for the last 4 years. We've been fighting for this exact admission, and here it is presented right to us. So I think the next step after this, once you are aware of unlawful activity taking place within the Department of Defense, the next natural step is to investigate that unlawfulness. So sometimes that looks like criminal investigations. Sometimes that looks like IG investigations. We know that, these issues have been raised through the DoD processes over the last 4 years and largely swept under the rug. But we're hoping that under this new administration, they'll be taken more seriously. And I do think that, criminal liability is very much on the table.
All right.
Criminal liability is very much on the table from a former JAG officer, one of the few that stood up and said, no, we have to follow the law. We can't rewrite the law like what was mentioned just in the first segment. My guest today is former Army infantryman Derek Wynn, who was harmed by this unlawful order and fights still today. It's why we're having him on the show to continue to get his story broadcast to the nation and to the leadership of this nation that these harms have to be remedied. And the steps taken so far, even in this Trump administration, which I fully support, and the Secretary of Defense, which I fully support, it's not enough. We have to continue to steadily go down the path to where we have the right things in place to remedy the harms to these Americans. Derek, you were talking before the break about how, the events leading up to when you refused and everything. And, I wanted to play that clip because we have a JAG that says that now that the unlawful word has finally been used by the right person, that criminal liability is a factor. And the lawyer that wrote that letter, I think she was, in a way, held accountable. They tried to promote her to another agency under the Trump administration when they came in, and she was let go from that, the way I understand it. But even that's not enough, because tell folks what happened to you. How did your command and chain treat you? And were you punished under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for standing up for your rights? And folks, I want to ask you this too, Derek. Were you ever advised that you did not have to accept an EUA, an emergency use authorization vaccine, even if it was FDA licensed?
Negative. And initially, when it first became mandatory and I refused, I would receive negative counselings once a week, once every few weeks. And I would receive them from my team leader, my squad leader, my platoon sergeant, and my first sergeant, and then my commander. So every few weeks I would receive a stack of counselings, and eventually they started handing out GOMARs, which was a general officer memorandum of reprimand, and it was placed into my permanent file by a person I'd never met, I'd never spoken with. They'd never listened to my story. During the process, I filed an appeal for my GOMAR, articulating why I was refusing, articulating the minutiae distinctions between these FDA approved and these new mRNA technology shots. And I put like a small little tamper seal on the packet, and when I got that packet back, that tamper seal was never even broken. So it showed me that the person that was reading my appeal never even read it. It's nothing I can prove in court, but it was just something I kind of wanted to see for my own, knowledge. And so I realized that these people were everything was coming from the top down. So nobody could have listened to my appeal if they had wanted to. But my direct leadership, once I filed my appeal, my commander actually read it, and he came back to me. We were on the firing range, and he pulled me off to the side and he told me, hey, Win, I just want to let you know, I read your packet and you articulated your point very well, and you actually caused me to have to go back and kind of reevaluate some things that some decisions that I made. And I'm kind of second guessing my choices because I never thought to look into it this deep. And so the people who I was able to speak with, and I was a little bit older, I joined later on in life, so I wasn't just this young, ignorant private. I was able to tell these guys, and plead my case, so that once I was able to do that, they kind of got off my back. But there was still, mandates from top down to where, they tried to do everything they could to make our life as miserable as possible. And but for my direct leadership, the ones I was able to articulate to them, my reasonings, they kind of cooled off. And then it was just basically levels and levels above them. And they were kind of telling me, hey, man, I'm going to go to bat for you as much as I can, but a lot of this is out of my hands. So I was given a GOMAR, and I was flagged. Basically, I was ineligible for promotion. I was ineligible to take leave. Just basically I had this, this red mark on my career, and the GOMAR is like a career killer. So this paperwork was really prohibitive. It stopped a lot of people's lives. And so a lot of people, once they stopped kicking people out for, directly for COVID, there's all these people who still have flags on their name. So they spent so long without being promotable, and now you failed to promote. So now you're getting kicked out for that. So they're finding all these ways to side skirt it through legal jargon, basically, or even with the adverse side effects. They're not labeling these adverse side effects, a direct result of these shots. They're just saying people had these pre-existing conditions that they must have met during MEPS. And they're doing everything they can to obfuscate the data. Even the PACT Act, was put out so that they could obfuscate the data around the huge uptick in cancers that are going to be a direct result of all of this stuff. So now if you add the PACT Act in there, and there's hundreds of thousands of claims from Vietnam and Agent Orange, it'll be 40 years before the world puts everything together. But within the DoD, whistleblowers started to report these adverse effects, and instead of listening to them and hearing these grievances, they silenced these people, and they took away their credentials and locked them out of the system so they couldn't get these numbers out to the world. But before that happened, people took screen grabs and people pulled the info and stuff like that off of the DMED system. And that's basically the system within the Department of Defense that all of our medical information is stored in, all of our families, all of our children's medical information is stored in. So it made us the perfect subset for the entire population of the country, basically. They were using us, in my opinion, as lab rats for these shots. And because we were getting the first batches, we were going to be the first ones to report on it. And they silenced anybody who was putting a bad name or putting a bad taste in the people's mouths for this mRNA technology, because they were still trying to sell this in the civilian sector. So if it had gotten out that the DoD was being ravaged by this stuff, they wouldn't have been able to sell it to anyone. So there was an obvious, you could see all of these agencies colluding with one another to spin a single narrative. And that single narrative focused on how mRNA technology was the end-all be-all. It was the only cure. There was no room for ivermectin or any of these generic alternatives, because you couldn't bring an EUA product to market if there was a cheap and effective generic alternative. So that's why they were, painting Joe Rogan's face green on, on the news and stuff like that, trying to sway public opinion on these other cures for this stuff, because it was a PR move. They were selling a product to the American people. And there's a lot of people who believe that, the DoD basically sold us off to be used, to these pharmaceutical companies as lab rats and stuff like that, because the heart conditions that people were developing, it's escaping me at the top of my head right now, myocarditis, pericarditis, stuff like that, that was elevated in basically military age males. So we were like the perfect subset to be used as a test for that. And so there was this obvious, they were trying to snuff this message out to keep it from getting to the world. So that alone was even more reason to want to oppose what they were doing. And they were using medical professionals to gaslight us into saying things like, oh, well, Thomas Jefferson promoted vaccines to fight off the scourges of smallpox during the Revolutionary War, and trying to appeal to our patriotism and stuff like that. And there were people who were labeled insider threats. They weaponized the mental health system against soldiers. And people need to realize this. Soldiers have killed themselves because of what the DoD was doing to them. So they've weaponized the mental health system. They weaponized CPS. They would threaten to take away people's children because they go to school on a DoD facility and their kids weren't vaccinated. So this whole hey, these 8,000 people who were kicked out, we can just buy them off. We can buy their silence with back pay, and everything's hush hush. Trump's back in office, so America, that's not going to cut it, because the damages that were done were institutional from the top down. So we need to basically, even these commanders, this was structured in a way to make the commanders the fall guys. While this was happening, it was written in the law that says that the commanders were obligated to be able to facilitate these vaccines. And no commander even read it. They were all just being handed these packets, signing at the bottom. And so a lot of them, this was built in. This wasn't something that was just cooked up overnight. This was premeditated since long before, after the anthrax debacle, and they just tried to run it back 2.0. And so they designed it in a way to where everyone's culpable in the crime. So your ability to get, we're fighting not only against people in failures of leadership who failed at their job, and we're asking them to hold themselves accountable, but we're also fighting against the psychology of people who were tricked by this. So if you're going to try to convince somebody who was tricked, you better be prepared for them to fight you tooth and nail on it, because the psychological aspect of that is insurmountable. So, and then, God forbid, parents were stricken with enough fear to put this into their children. And now their children's lives are forever changed for this. So this is not just a DOD issue. This is a nationwide issue. And the reason why the DOD's fight is so important is because everything that was done to us was done with signatures at the bottom of that paperwork. And we can prove the top-down mechanisms of coercion that were used against us, and we can extrapolate this into every sector of society. People like Mary Talley Bowden, teachers, firefighters, police officers, every sector of society, we can extrapolate the same top-down tactics that were used to basically force people into choosing between your life or your livelihood, and then ostracizing those who chose to buck against it. And for me, this was a litmus test. This was a litmus test for freedom, and America failed miserably. They basically put us in positions, to benefit from cowering and living on your knees, and we collectively failed this mission, and this is our fight, is everyone's fight. We can be the tip of the spear on this, and we can basically, if everyone would get behind us and help us in this fight in proving this premeditated fraud, we can basically nullify these manufacturers' immunity from liability by exposing fraud. And that'll open up the floodgates to all of these lawsuits, and people can finally get justice. But this has to happen from a top-down level, just like it was implemented. Because what they're doing is the DOD is intentionally putting the onus on the individual so that it as an institution can save face. And so that it as an institution can sweep all of this under the rug. But the DOD needs to wear this scar. The DOD needs to wear this so that the future leaders of this institution can see what happens when failure of leadership takes over, when there's weakness in leadership, and when people who are susceptible to the hard, taking the easy left instead of the hard right, we don't need them in positions of leadership. And we saw globally what happens when these cowards are able to lead, and they're not elected through meritocracy or whatever. So, the DOD can learn from this, but we as a nation, we are not a nation that just hides our flaws and pretends they don't exist. We need to wear that, and take it on the chin, have some integrity, and call ourselves out for our own shortcomings. And we collectively failed. If we had universally shrugged this off, like if 80-90% of us had just rebelled against this would have been a drop of water on our back. They would have never been able to do this, but they eroded away.
Another break. When we come back, I want to continue that train of thought and start with how they characterized your discharge, what you did about it, if you got any good results about it. But we want to continue this because you've gone to your congressman, your senator, your governor, and haven't gotten any results, and I want to hear that story. We'll be right back with Derek Wynn, U.S. Army infantry veteran, harmed by the unlawful COVID vaccine order.
We went over a little bit. Colonel Burton will get to you when
So he uses the term unlawful orders. I have to believe that he chooses his words very carefully when he says this. Those two words, unlawful orders, mean a lot, don't they? Can you explain why?
So those words are extremely important. And I would actually love to have been a fly on the wall to see, who was advising him. And you said in your opening commentary that he's making big waves. As someone who sat as a JAG and watched the behind the scenes on how every word in a memo, how every word in a speech is parsed out, this is a huge wave to have him use those words unlawful. And the implication of him using those words is that it vitiates all of the actions that have been taken against service members over the course of the entire mandate. And it really, it presents a huge problem, not only for the DoD, but for individual commanders in their personal capacities, especially depending on what these investigations reveal and how much they knew about whether or not these orders were unlawful. I know that there are multiple scenarios where the unlawfulness of these orders was specifically and expressly raised to commanders who completely disregarded it. And the level of culpability and the level of exposure to some kind of litigation opens up tremendously when you have evidence that this was conducted knowingly versus, some people who were pawns that were just carrying water for these orders.
So
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Truth Thursday, and my guest today is Army infantry veteran Derek Wynn. And, ladies and gentlemen, the infantry is who we in America send to kill the enemy up close and personal. We train them to bayonet people. When you bayonet somebody, you're right in their face, looking them in the eye. We expect them to have the courage to do that, and we expect them to have the courage to call out unlawful orders, and we are supposed to celebrate them. And Derek, before the break, you said we as a country had failed, and it starts with the Department of Defense, and you're exactly right. The solution to this has to be done in the Department of Defense before successful solutions outside in the rest of our society. I think you're exactly right. I've not heard anybody put it that way. And God bless you for that, because you're exactly right on that. We've got a question from the audience I want to take before we talk about how they characterize your discharge and what you did about it. Let's go to Rob, our host over there. Go ahead, Rob.
Hey, Colonel, we have Colonel Burton.
Hey, Derek, thank you for your service. Thank you for your courage. My question to you is, what would it take and what do you need to see to get to a point where you would recommend your children and your grandchildren serve in the military, given what we've seen happen?
I'm going to be perfectly honest. There would have to be drastic punishment for the leaders at the highest levels of this military who knowingly betrayed the trust of the sons and daughters of this country who were willing to die and serve, this country with their life. That to me is not something that can be taken lightly. That to me is the most treacherous act of treason. I would expect this from the enemy. I would expect this from someone not at the head of an institution that rules from a position of moral authority. I would expect that from anything but an organization that I was willing to die for. Like at the bottom of the stack, you have to be willing to trust in your leadership at every level. You have to be able to trust at layers of leadership. And people in those positions, they besmirched the entire institution. They besmirched this country. They spit in the face of millions of people that died before them to give us what we have now. And from their position, their position of their ivory tower of authority, they destroyed everything. So as a voluntary force, people of good conscience, men and women of quality, are not going to want to serve a hollow husk of this, of everything it claims to be. It's going to take a lot. I would have to see the exact opposite of what's happening right now. What's happening right now is I believe the institution is trying to save face as a whole and trying to make sure that, 20 years from now, mankind doesn't remember what they truly did. So it would take a lot, basically, is my answer.
Yeah, and what we see, Derek, that's a hard question to answer, too, what Colonel Burton asked you, and I totally understand it. I get that question a lot, too. And what we're seeing now is Secretary Hegseth and President Trump, I think they're honest in their approach, but you can see in the memos that come out of the structure, the infrastructure of USDPNR, the manpower shops, and those kind of things. That's where these memos are being drafted at, that they're not leaning into it boldly and accepting that this was an unlawful order and that the harms have to be remedied to the satisfaction of the individual, and the responsibility is on the institution to do that instead of the individual to do that. I think is what I've heard you say. That's what I've been seeing as somebody that also signed the DMA but wasn't on active duty when you all went through this. So that picture has to be settled so that the people that are writing the memos and implementing the policy give clear guidance to commanders and give clear guidance that makes the institution put its arms around someone like you and bring them back in without putting the responsibility on you, but is able to satisfy the harm and remedy the harm. And I don't see that happening either.
Basically, what's happened is the DOD jaywalked on the way to commit a murder, and they want to admit to the jaywalking and sweep the murder under the rug. And the general public is still entirely unaware of exactly what happened to us. So they want to try to do their best to erase our GOMARs, erase all the negative paperwork, try to buy us back with money that was already allocated to them through the taxpayers, and use the fact that they pushed us into financial ruin and dangle this, carrot on the stick in front of us to where hopefully if they can get enough of us to come back, then they can say the recruiting and retention crisis, the mass exodus that happened as a direct result of this shot mandate, they can say that that's no longer an issue. So it seems
your discharge actually said for serious misconduct on it, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah. So a violation of a serious offense. I was given a general discharge, stripped of all my benefits, kicked out, pretty much left homeless. If I hadn't had, a few grand in savings and fortunately been able to move in with my girlfriend's parents at 35 years old like a bum, I'd have been another statistic, but there's thousands of other people who are far worse than me. I was 2 years in the game. There's people who've got 20 years of service. Their entire lives were thrown away, like insane stuff. Like anybody listening to this, please, Senior Airman Lance Castle, people need to know his story. This man, he was crucified by the DOD for standing up to this. And people of merit, people who were willing to buck back and not bend the knee, those are the people who were hammered the hardest. And those are the people who were being silenced, and no one wants to truly hear their stories. Think First Lieutenant Mark Bashaw, people need to know his story. And these are the true war. Ted Macy. There's a lot of us, man, and we were given these negative discharges. And as soon as I got kicked out, I appealed that. I sent my letters off to the Army Discharge Review Board. I sent them the same appeal packet that I sent during my GOMAR, stating, I clearly requested an FDA-approved vaccine. None was ever made available to me. They never had one. Boom. And I don't hear anything back for 6 to 8 months. So I started going to my congressman every day. Every few times a week, I'm going to my congressman's office with a 3-ring binder full of evidence of crimes against humanity, trying to get him to act on this in one way or another. And every step of the way, he wanted to keep me at arm's length. He wanted to treat this as an individual issue and treat me as like a disgruntled individual who was upset for being kicked out of the military, instead of this canary in the coal mine trying to bring to him this, proof of these grand crimes that were being committed. Because at the time, I believed he's a conservative politician, and these, crimes are being committed against members of the military. I thought for sure you know, he would eat this right up. He would be totally interested in this. But they basically kept me at arm's length, refused to talk to me. I get a letter back from the Army Discharge Review Board saying, hey, due to the sheer number and complexity of these cases, it's going to take us at least 24 months before we can review your case for an upgrade to your status. And at the time, I couldn't, you know, get a job because I was kicked out of the military. And if I tried to explain why I was kicked out of the military, it was this vaccine issue. It was such a contentious subject. I couldn't even get unemployment because I couldn't prove that I had an honorable discharge. So there's all these thousands of ways that institutionally people fell through the cracks, and this ruined people's lives like in an immeasurable way. So after they tell me, hey, it's going to be 2 years before we can review your paperwork, I go to my Congressman Brian Babin, and they tell me, oh, well, if you don't hear anything in the next 2 years, let us know. They had zero appetite, you know, to check in on if I was you know, homeless on the streets, or, you know, at the time I was expressing how much this was hurting me, you know, mentally. And I was, you know, they showed zero, you know, desire to represent me in any way. And I was begging members of his office for a meeting with my congressman. You know, I told him, hey, you know, at least let me get a phone call, a Zoom meeting or something. I'll drive to Washington on my own dime if that's what it takes, you know, for me to meet with my own elected representative. And every step of the way, they gave me these pleasantries, anything they could to just get me off the phone. And so I go to Ted Cruz. I speak with Ted Cruz. I speak with his former military legislative assistant, Tim Dill, who is now the head of USD personnel and readiness. He's the one who actually sent us out these letters saying, hey, you can come back in this most recent packet. But I've spent hours on the phone with him, meticulously articulating the things that I'm explaining to you right now. So the fact that I know for firsthand, I have emails between him and I, that he has firsthand knowledge of the stuff that I'm bringing to you guys, and he's still out here acting like he has a desire to bring us back, and you know, but he's burying the lead. What they're doing is not admitting the true crime, so they can try to buy us back and cover it up under the rug, and the DOD as a whole can save face.
And that's why unlawful order is extremely important. We got to take one last break, Derek. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation and dig into that unlawful order piece to this, because you're exactly right. The infrastructure below the secretary is not acknowledging this is an unlawful order and everything that goes along with that. We'll be right back with Derek Wynn, Army veteran.
But with Brandon, it's always cutting edge stuff happening in the world, and it's not just from the political angle, because you can get that on other platforms, but it's always from the biblical angle. So you're dealing with a guy that loves Jesus, you're dealing with a guy that's very intelligent, you're dealing with a guy that is cutting edge conservatism, and you're dealing with a guy that wants to be biblical all at the same time. And so for that reason alone, I hope many, many people will not just lift up his ministry in prayer, but will also financially get behind it, because from the angle I'm trying to describe, he really is the only game in town. And we desperately need it in these last days. Can I get an amen to that?
You could look at possible criminal charges. You could look at civil charges, opening up lawsuits from some of these soldiers. Are we talking about not just generals at the top making these decisions and pushing them down to their troops, but could a captain at an Army barrack someplace who made their platoon get vaccinated, could that captain be liable in this?
In true lawyer fashion, I'll say it depends. It depends on what the investigation, the facts would bear out, but there very well could be liability at an individual level. You know, there are things that are conducted in your official capacity, and you gain some kind of protection and immunity for that. But if let's say hypothetically, if there was a conspiracy to deprive these service members of rights, and if this was done knowingly, are you actually acting within your official capacity, or are you taking this frolic outside of what is within the realms of your position to order. So I do think that investigations need to take place so that we can see at what levels, how much was known at what levels. And, unfortunately, I think that there are probably people in the military who didn't realize that they were violating people's rights, but that might very well get caught up in this.
And look, there was a conspiracy. I can tell you where the conspiracy point of entry is. It's that legal counsel letter saying that the non-FDA approved vaccine could be used to replace the FDA approved vaccine that made the order that Secretary Austin signed somewhat legal. But even then, no human being in the United States of America can legally be forced to take a vaccine that is still emergency use authorization that includes the men and women that wear the uniform of this country. That's where the conspiracy started. My guest today is Army infantry veteran Derek Wynn, and we're talking about his story of what happened to him and getting his thoughts on what needs to happen. And Derek, before the break, you were talking about your discharge and your Congressman and Senator Cruz's staffer, Mr. Dill, who's now in the USDP in our structure, I think as the Assistant Secretary for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. So is very familiar with your case and having spent hours on it with them. First of all, your discharge, was it ever fixed?
Yes, sir. Eventually it was fixed, and in a 5-0 vote, it was unanimously upgraded to an honorable discharge. And in the reasoning for doing so, the Army Discharge Review Board laid out on paper that the reasoning for my discharge upgrade was because the DoD was unable to facilitate the mandates that I was being kicked out for failing to comply with. So that document was actually one of the first documents, to my knowledge, and to our little network's knowledge, of any government official putting on paper what we all knew to be true. And so at this time, I was going to my congressman and my senator, basically asking them to write a letter to the House Armed Services Committee, asking them if and why not service members weren't offered the FDA-approved vaccines that we were mandated to take. Because in my eyes, that would have been, if they were truly advocates of our cause, that would have been all we needed to get this ball rolling years ago. And that would have been basically opening up the floodgates, because we would have gotten any government official to put on paper what we all know to be true. But because they all refuse to touch this with a 10-foot pole because it's political suicide, they've been able to kick the can years down the road. And so I eventually was able to attend a political rally where Greg Abbott was, and so I personally handed our Declaration of Military Accountability and a few more documents to Greg Abbott himself, shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and told him, a brief 30-second synopsis of what was going on, and told him, hey man, like I was made homeless because of this, and there's thousands of others like me, and thousands of Texas service members and our bravest women and children were hurt by this. So please, if you truly love this state, like don't get caught up by the federal issue. Like crimes were committed in Texas against Texans, and as a governor of this country, or as a governor of this state, I would expect him to at least have said something about it or whatever. But it's been over a year and a half, not a word. I've never gotten a single phone call from anyone from his office. And so what I've been trying to do is basically expose these because people on the other side of the aisle, people on the left, they'll look at us as like these anti-vax conspiracy theorists or whatever, and I kind of expect that. But people on the right, they've kind of there's been these charlatans, that pretend to advocate for our cause, but they keep us just close enough to kind of serve as a pressure release valve and silence our legitimate grievances. And as soon as we start developing enough pressure, they'll throw us a bone and kind of serve as a pressure release valve. So even with this recent SecDef claim, notice how he said out loud that it was unlawful, but it wasn't written down on paperwork.
Right.
And so there's a huge distinction between that. And so we're getting these little, like, these low hanging fruit wins every 6 months or so. But in my mind, what they're doing is kind of gaming social awareness and kind of letting the rabbit out of the hat little by little so that the American populace can kind of digest it. And they're trying to find a way to make this a political kind of, put this all on the Biden administration and make this a political thing. But in reality, this is an institution. Like I've said this before, people are willing to die for the Constitution and people are willing to die for the institution. And people like me who are at the bottom of the stack, who truly believe in the values that this country, claims to stand on, I'm willing to die for the Constitution. And there are people within this institution who are doing everything they can to preserve their positions of power within this corrupted institution. And we need to be able to have, tough conversations with our own, not with, whatever. We need to be able to look our own in the eyes and say, what are you doing about this? You know about this, and your lack of action has allowed this problem to fester. And mRNA technology has made leaps and bounds of progress since, what happened within the DoD. And if we don't establish the legal precedents necessary to prevent them from doing it again, they're just going to run it back. And I think that's why politicians are refusing to look at this, because they know we have a checkmate, we have them dead to rights. So if anybody were to look at the evidence, it's undeniable what happened. So if they can just try to sweep it under the rug and obfuscate the truth around the true totality of what happened, the DoD as a whole will be able to save face, and they'll burn a few commanders who they set up to roll on, and they'll buy back a few people who are willing to take a buy off to come back. And then the principled people who will never come back, they'll just never come back, and the DoD will be lesser for that. But they're willing to accept that in order to cover up their crimes. And if we allow them to get away with that, everything that this country pretends to be is null and void. And we are collectively allowing corruption to take over these institutions, that millions of people have put their lives on the line for and died for. It's we rule the world from this position of moral authority, and we need to actually uphold that. If the DoD is willing to do this to their own, there's nothing they're not willing to do.
That's the problem.
That's not.
Generals and admirals and SESs have fought to protect this institution instead of to protect the Constitution that they swore their lives to defend and support. Instead, they turned to the institution itself. Now the institution is in preservation mode, and it's enabled by people that think that way. So we got a couple minutes left here. Let me take a question from the audience real quick, and then I want to get your take on what advice you would give Secretary Hegseth to try to get this policy right. Go ahead, Rob.
Colonel, we have Patriot Paul.
Hey, thanks, Derek. Sorry for everything you've been put through. And I'm going to quote you on that. I really do agree with there's people that swear allegiance to defend the Constitution, and then there's those that swear to defend the institution. That's a great quote. But as a newly enlisted member of the Army, do you have, and someone that's also scared to death to ruffle the waters concerning vax, when you go to boot, there's like 17, 18, 19 vaccinations that you're supposed to go through. Is there any advice you have for newly enlisted? We're hitting great numbers now that Trump's in office, and people want to support and defend and sign their name on the dotted line and defend the Constitution. Our numbers are out of the.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Appreciate it. Go ahead, Derek. Answer his question. What advice would you give new enlisted guys and gals?
So honestly, I went through a kind of a weird stage. I went through kind of before the mandates were a thing. So they were kind of They're kind of fast and loose with the shots and stuff, but as far as opposing the shots or anything like that, I honestly didn't oppose the other shots. I took all the other shots and everything like that. It was only the mRNA shots that I opposed, and I did so off of this principled stance. But what they've done now is they've mixed the mRNA. I believe so. I don't want to misspeak on it, but I believe that they've mixed this mRNA technology into the general flu vaccine as well. So they're trying to pull another kind of like, you can't refuse the flu vaccine. They're adding it into the mix. So,
yeah,
I honestly,
I'm unfortunately, and that right there is where we have to leave it. That's the problem that you were just talking about. The flu vaccine is now being treated as if it's the COVID vaccine, and they're actually kicking a pilot out that we need desperately out of the Air Force right now because of the flu vaccine. Well, folks, tomorrow or next week on Monday is More War Monday. We'll have Matthew Brunerman to talk about his book, War Business, The Hired Guns of Helmand Province. And that's going to be another great show right here on the Rob Maness Show on Worldview Tube. I'll see you then.